Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Today we're going to explore the mystery of twins and what the research is telling us about twins and their relationships. My guest today is Dr. Nancy Segal. Dr. Segal is an award-winning professor of psychology at Cal State Fullerton, and she is also the founder and director of the Twin Studies Center. Welcome, Nancy, and thank you for taking time away from your very busy schedule to spend time with us in the studio.
It's my pleasure, Dave.
Well, you are a world-renowned researcher in this area and author as well, but perhaps now we should start the conversation by revealing to our audience why it is that you became so interested in this area of academic research, that is, twin studies.
Dave, there are actually two reasons why I'm in this field, and the first is that I am a twin myself. I have a fraternal twin sister, Anne, who looks and behaves nothing like me. And I was always so fascinated with that as a child, wondering how two children could end up in the same family with the same experiences and yet be so very different. And then I went to college at Boston University and majored in psychology and took a wonderful class in personal adjustment. And in the course of writing an assignment for that class, I came upon twin studies. And I was just hooked. I thought they were fascinating. I could relate to them both personally and professionally. And so my career was essentially sealed when I was a senior in college.
And you are a fraternal twin, as you just mentioned, so we should probably identify what those terms mean. Fraternal twin means that you have what's called a dizygotic situation. When the mother is ready to have twins, there are actually two separate embryos that were fertilized, so they're independent of each other. That's different from the identical twins, which are called monozygotic, which is one egg initially. It's one zygote, which is the precursor to the embryo. That splits into two embryos, and then you have two sets of children, two embryos. They're the exact same genetic material. So identical twins are different from fraternal twins.
Well, I can see that you've really done your homework. You've got it exactly right. And the beauty of the two types of twins is that we can compare the similarities in identical pairs to the similarities in fraternal pairs. If the identicals are more alike with respect to intelligence, personality, job satisfaction, or self-esteem, this tells us that those traits have a partial genetic effect. And we find that for virtually all measured traits, there is some genetic component. It's a beautiful, natural design.
And so you talked about in the first question or the first answer about the fact that there were differences between you and your sister in terms of personality and traits and so on. But with identical twins, we find that they tend to be more similar. Why is that?
Identical twins are much more alike than fraternal twins on virtually every measured trait. And the reason for that is that they share their genes. They are 100% genetically the same. And so in combination with the environments in which they're raised, their behaviors, their intelligence, their personalities are fairly well matched. It's not perfect similarity. In fact, we don't find correlations of one for anything that we measure in identicals. But the important point is they are much more alike than any other pair of people. And we need that comparison of the fraternals. I think that many people are so struck by the visual interest of identical twins, but fraternals are the essential comparison group in any twin research project.
And if we talk about the identicals, they do have some minor differences. For example, they don't have the same fingerprints, and in some cases one might have schizophrenia and the other not.
Well, that's a major difference.
Okay, well that wouldn't be a minor difference. As you say, that would be major. Yeah. Are there environmental influences or what we would refer to as epigenetic influences that affect these differences among identicals?
Well, it's important to point out, as you say, that identical twins are not exactly the same. And this can happen for a variety of reasons. It could be some prenatal effect. Perhaps one twin received more prenatal nutrition than the other twin. In fact, the birth weights of identical twins are less alike than the birth weights of fraternal twins, although over time they eventually become more concordant. But epigenetics, the turning on and turning off of genes, that does not change the DNA, but what it does change is the expression of those particular traits. That's also a possibility. It could be postnatal exposures to certain things, an infection or some traumatic event could cause a difference between identical twins. And this is what's so fascinating, because when we see differences between identical twins, it can tell us what is the effect that might cause or prevent a condition in the non-twin population. So twin studies are not just for twins. They're a model for looking at behavior and medical conditions for everybody else.
And a description of you that was written recently said that as a professor of developmental psychology, Dr. Segal's interests lie in the juncture of genetics, evolutionary psychology, and twin studies. What does that all mean?
Well, it all means that research is now very highly interdisciplinary. And so behavior genetics is a study of the genetic transmission of behavior across generations. And no better way to study that than to use twin studies. And I'm very interested in development. And so if you look at twin studies over time, that will give you clues as to how different traits might change and why. And if you think about evolutionary psychology, the idea of trying to find out why certain behaviors are adaptive in our current environment, why they remained throughout the course of human history, twin studies are also a way of looking at specific hypotheses related to evolutionary psychology, particularly when it comes to cooperation between individuals.
Well, let's talk about the frequency of twins, because they are actually, fraternal twins at least, are becoming more frequent today. We'll get to that in just a moment. But as far as fraternal versus identical, you're much more likely to have fraternal twins because they are two separate eggs that are fertilized, whereas the other one involves that splitting of one zygote, which is much more rare. So statistically speaking, about 1 out of every 333 births, or 3 out of 1,000, would be identical, whereas with the fraternal twins, it's more like 3 out of 100, or about 3%. That number has actually started to go up pretty dramatically since about 1980. In fact, I think it's up at least 76% since then. Why is that?
Okay, well, let's first talk about natural twinning rates and the twinning rates we're seeing now. The natural twinning rate is about 1 in 80 births. Since 1980, the twinning rate has actually gone up to 1 in 30 births in Western countries. And there were 2 reasons for that. The first reason is that women are delaying the childbearing years to establish themselves professionally, to complete educational programs. And so when you delay the childbearing years, what you're doing is increasing the probability of releasing 2 eggs. Now, you can think of that as a reproductive mistake because women are best geared to having 1 baby at a time. On the other hand, it's kind of a nice mistake to have 2 children at one time, instant family, 1 hospital bill. Now, the other reason that twinning is going up, and this counts for about 2/3 of the rise, are fertility treatments, fertility drugs, in vitro fertilization, other reproductive technologies that assist infertile women in having families. But one thing that's important to point out is that it's not just fraternal twinning that's going up, but it's also identical twinning, albeit not at the same rate. When you micromanipulate an egg in the laboratory for in vitro fertilization purposes, this also increases the probability of splitting of that fertilized egg. And so many couples who undergo fertility treatment and produce twins who are identical are sort of shocked because they're expecting fraternals. But the identical twinning rate has gone up, and one more reason that has contributed to this is that we're much better able to detect twin pregnancies and to manage them throughout their pregnancy.
So scientific manipulation, if you will, has had a pretty important impact on all of
Yes,
this.
it has.
Okay, well, let's talk about diet, because there are some studies that show that diet also plays a role in twinning.
That's right.
And what about the diet, and what about vegans who are not able to have twins nearly as easily as people that are not vegans?
Well, they know that protein is a very, very important constituent in the diet if one is going to have twins. And vegans tend to have a lower rate of twinning than people who are meat eaters who get a lot of the natural protein. They also know that in the Yoruba tribe in western Nigeria, it seems that a very particular kind of sweet potato, the white yam, seems to be linked to the high rate of twinning among the Yoruba from western Nigeria. And it's not just the white yam, but it may also be something about those women. For some reason, they have a genetic propensity to release 2 or 3 eggs at the same time. Keep in mind, too, that the Yoruba women have been on this diet for all their lives, so there might well be a cumulative effect. Whereas I think that women today here in the US, if they wanted to have twins, should not just start eating white yams all of a sudden because they might be disappointed.
Apparently there is some sort of natural phytoestrogen in that white yam, but as you say, it's not necessarily going to yield twins just if you start eating it today, hoping for the best.
That's right. Fraternal twinning is a very complex process, and there are many factors linked to it. One is genetic predisposition in the family. If you're of African descent, you have a higher rate of twinning. if you're a taller, heavier mother. Seasonality has been implicated, frequency of intercourse. Many, many things affect fraternal twinning. But here's the interesting thing, Dave, that as much as we study identical twinning, no one really knows why that fertilized egg divides. And I think that's fascinating.
Okay, well, let's talk about a study that was conducted, and the results were released in May of 2015. And this was a report that was issued in a journal called Nature Genetics. There were researchers, I think you know who those researchers are. One was from Amsterdam, I believe, and the other was from Australia. They studied 50 years worth of research on twins, right. And it covered something like 14.5 million right. twins. And the central question was, is it nature, in other words, genetics, or is it nurture, or the environment, that has the most effect upon us to make us who we are? And there have always been debates about that, nature versus nurture. Well, the report came out that it actually worked out to about 49% genetics, 51% environmental or nurture. What about that? Is that in any way surprising, and what does it tell us?
It's not surprising to me at all. And in fact, we really don't speak about nature or nurture anymore. It's really nature and nurture, because they both affect everything about human behavior and development. But that's really what I expect. And I think that what's great about that report is that it brought together results from so many different studies, different investigators, different countries, different methodologies. And so when you find this convergence, it's really quite persuasive. And I think that is one of the landmark studies that's come out in the last couple of years.
So if it's roughly 50-50, the researchers said it's basically a draw. It's both. And it could be one or the other, but it's really a combination of the two. But knowing that it's about 50% genetics, does that mean that twins that are identical twins that are raised apart still have about a 50% chance of turning out with the same personality traits?
Well, what the 50% means is it's really based on populations or on groups. And so one particular identical pair could be very, very much alike, and one particular identical pair might be very, very different. But when you average them all together, which is where you're really going to get the important information, it ends up being about 50%. Remember, these estimates called heritability or degree of genetic influence are describing the variation from person to person in a group. In a particular individual, you can't slice apart their personality or ability into a genetic environmental component. So I would say that on average, most identical twins are going to be pretty much alike. They're not going to be exactly alike. Some pairs will be more alike than others. Fraternal twins, same thing. They might be very much alike in some traits, very different than others. But overall, identicals as a group will be more alike than the fraternal twins.
And on that note, we have to go to a break, and stay with us. After the break, we'll continue this conversation about twin studies. It's fascinating, and it's going to get even more fascinating. So stay with us.
Who designs things like needle-free diabetes care, robotic checkups, and electronic aspirin? The answer, biomedical engineers. It is one of the most rapidly growing career fields in the United States. These people analyze and design solutions to problems in medicine and biology, improving the quality of patient care. With a degree from Cal State Long Beach, you can become a part of this amazing career field.
Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, and my guest today is Dr. Nancy Segal. And Nancy, before the break, I said it's going to get even more fascinating as we delve into this even more. Well, we've kind of established the science of all of this. Now we can talk about specific traits and how those traits develop over time and characteristics. And I want to talk a little bit more about fraternal twins. Fraternal twins, of course, are two separately fertilized eggs which are independent of each other. They're not the identical ones, but they can also have some similarities as well. And I want to talk about a particular case that you found that's in the Guinness Book of World Records. Two women, I believe they're from England, and they were brought together after 78 years of being separated. How did that happen, and what were the results of that reunion?
Well, that was one of the most fascinating cases I've been involved with, Dave. These were women born in England 78 years ago, and one moved to the US when she was in her 20s, and always knew she was a twin because she'd been raised by a biological mother, whereas the other one was adopted, had no idea she was a twin. And then the daughter of the one in England began to do a search for her mother's genealogy and discovered her mother was a twin. Got in touch with her mother, who was living in Oregon. And I was notified, and I thought, how marvelous to bring them together. So I did. I brought them together at Cal State Fullerton, and it was a wonderful reunion. They are the world's longest separated pair of twins, which is why their record still stands in the Guinness Book. We brought them into my laboratory for a 2-day, very intensive assessment. And the twins were alike in some ways, but different than others. Their abilities, some of their interests were quite different. Both of them were swimmers, however, and took up swimming at a later age in life. But they were, I would say, very, very typical in terms of their similarity in the whole scheme of fraternal twinning. What was great about this case, though, was their relationship. The fact that they met each other after all this time. Unfortunately, they didn't have much time to develop that relationship. They were only together for a couple of days in my lab, about a week at the home of the twin in Oregon, and then they separated. 5 months later, the twin from the US passed away, which was very, very sad. But the one in England always said that she was just so grateful to have met her twin after all these years. It was a very special time for her.
Were they able to catch up meaningfully for those 78 years?
Well, I think they tried their best to do that. I think it's impossible to compress a lifetime of experiences into 1 week of time together, but I think they did their best.
That brings up another interesting topic that you've been researching, and that is when one twin loses another twin, or loses the other. And so upon death, the other twin is left without the other. How does that affect that person psychologically?
Losing a twin is one of the most devastating losses there is, and I think that it gets reported and underrepresented in the literature because people tend to focus on the loss of a child and the loss of a spouse, which of course are critical as well. But I've been studying this now for probably 20 years, and I have over 700 cases in my study, which is still ongoing, of twins who've lost a twin as an adult. And what we find are two things: that the identical loss, or the experience of losing an identical twin, is somewhat more devastating than a fraternal, which mirrors the kind of relationships they have when they're together. But we also find that the loss of a twin is the most devastating relative to other relatives such as parents, non-twin siblings, etc. The only relationship I cannot compare is the loss of a child, and I'm very grateful I can't because I don't want people to lose their children. Mm-hmm. Another fascinating thing is that a small number of those twins have also lost spouses, and the loss of a spouse seems to be way up there with the loss of a twin, which I think really underlines the importance of losing a twin and how bereavement counselors really need to pay greater attention to the unique aspects of that loss.
It also says a lot about emotional and psychological bonding, I guess.
It does, because it's a very strong bond, particularly between those identical twins and between some of the fraternals. And so the loss of that bond, for someone you've known all your life, is really quite devastating. And in fact, some specialized support groups have evolved just to help those twins get through that experience.
So is there a feeling of being incomplete somehow with the loss of the twin?
Well, that's one of the consequences, feeling incomplete. Birthdays become devastating days, holidays, any important, significant day becomes a day of a lack of celebration, whereas before it was celebrated.
All right, well, let's talk about something that's a little bit less morbid because it doesn't involve death and it involves talent that twins have. Let's say that the twins are born with a genetic predisposition for musical talent, for example. If they are raised apart for whatever reason, and one home is particularly good at promoting musical development or musical talent and the other is not, how will that potentially affect the twins?
Well, it could affect them in a number of ways, and in fact, the case that you raised was one that we studied exactly the same at the University of Minnesota. One of the women was raised in a home playing the piano, and there was a lot of pressure on her to become very good and to try to perhaps get into an orchestra, whereas the other one had much less pressure on her, and yet the one twin raised with less pressure ended up being a concert pianist, and the other one just practiced music as a hobby. What's interesting is that these environmental events are non-shared between the twins, and they work in unpredictable ways. You could imagine that the twin with more pressure might have gone on to be the pianist, but that was not the case. This is really one of the challenges that people in my field face when it comes to twin research.
Well, that's a whole nother dynamic is parental pressure, because I heard a story recently about a Major League Baseball player, not a twin, but a relevant story here. And this Major League Baseball player now has a son who's playing Little League. People always ask him, well, are you going to coach your son now that he's playing baseball so that he can become a big star? And the player says, no, I'm not going to be the coach. I'm going to go to the grandstand and watch and cheer him on. If he becomes a great baseball player, terrific. If not, I want to maintain that father-son relationship. And the reason is because his own father had pushed him so hard in a single-minded focus of making him a great baseball player that the rest of that relationship with his own father kind of fell apart.
Well, I think that's wise, and I think that brings up another interesting point about where talent comes from. And of course, one could say in that case that the young boy modeled his father and got into baseball because of that. But on the other hand, the father passes on the genes that are conducive to great athletic skill. So it's all confounded there. And that's why intact biological families are not good for teasing out genetic and environmental effects. That's why we turn to twin studies, particularly twins raised apart, and also studies of adopted children. They're excellent for looking at these kinds of things.
Okay, well, let's take a look at another area of research that you're focusing on as well, and that's twins from China that were separated because of the one-child policy in China. So you've started studying that. You have some preliminary results. What are those results telling you?
Yeah, I've been studying and tracking the development of young twin, mostly girls, who have been abandoned through the one-child policy and find themselves adopted by different families. And it turns out that when these children meet, as the mothers report, these children feel enormously attracted to one another and get along better than they've seen them get along with friends at school. And I find that quite fascinating. And I believe that it's probably the perceptions of similarities that are drawing them together and keeping them together. Now, I've not yet separated it by identical and fraternal. I have too few cases. But I think that when I do, I will be able to see if those twins mirror what we're seeing in adult reared apart twins and in adult and childhood twins who've been raised together.
Well, from a strictly scientific point of view or academic point of view, are there different protocols you use when studying identicals versus fraternal twins?
No, I use exactly the same protocols. Everything has to be exactly the same so you can make the relevant comparisons.
Okay, and so we've been talking about this throughout the program, but basically twins are a great laboratory, if you will.
Oh, the best.
For studying human traits and behavior, both the nature and the nurture side of the equation. So how do we extrapolate from this a greater truth to apply to the general population?
Well, if you discover that, say, alcoholism has a genetic component to it, or anxiety, which is what we found, then you can use that information to counsel families where there are individuals predisposed to alcoholism or to anxiety. So if you know that a child has a predisposition for alcoholism, you make sure that they stay away from alcoholic drugs or alcoholic beverages, and if they do engage in them, well, in moderation, very carefully monitored. If you're prone to anxiety, then you want to try to make decisions that put you into calmer situations, avoid anxiety-provoking situations, really get a handle on what creates these kinds of behaviors. As I said earlier, twin research is not just for twins, it's for the greater good. Now, there is a segment of twin research that is particular to twins. Do you put them in the same classroom? Do you dress them alike? Do you make sure they go to the same birthday parties? That's something totally different. And I think that's a very valid and very important area of research. But I like to go back and forth in both. I think that both are extremely important.
Well, let's talk about the concept of unrelated lookalikes. These are people that look very similar, and they're brought together. There are folks that have brought them together for photography sessions and so on. And a lot of people kind of assume that, well, they look alike, so they probably act alike and have similar traits based on appearance. But your research finds that that's really not the case.
I've blown that one out of the water. Well, I have been lucky to get access to samples of people who look alike but are genetically unrelated. And I find that they are very different in personality and in self-esteem. And I think that many people assume, as you said, that if you look alike, you're going to be treated a certain way. But that really shows that that's not the case. Now, that's an important thing that I found because many people say that identical twins are alike because of their similar features and the way people treat them. It is true that people treat identical twins alike, but it's because identical twins' behaviors evoke that similar treatment, right? And If that were not the case, the lookalikes should be as alike as the identicals, and we find they simply are not.
We're running out of time, Nancy. Unfortunately, the time passes so quickly when we have these conversations. But I'd like you to narrow down the results of your research into a couple of major themes for our audience. And if you could distill this mountain of research that you've accumulated, what are those major themes?
The major theme is that genetics is pervasive. That is, it affects virtually every measured trait. The degree of genetic influence may vary from trait to trait, being higher, say, in height or weight, lower in job satisfaction, in the middle for personality, but it affects every measured trait. Another point is that sharing an environment with somebody, just growing up with them, does not make you alike. What makes you alike is the shared genes. We know that because identical twins raised apart are as alike in personality as identical twins raised together. And we haven't gotten to my study on virtual twins, which are individuals who are the same age and raised together in the same home, so they're twin-like in nature without being twins, and they are very, very different. So when we have these different studies pointing to the same result, I think we can be pretty confident that we found something worth looking at.
We have 30 seconds left. You have a couple of book projects in the works. What are those projects?
The first one, Twin Misconceptions, 70 beliefs about twins. I evaluate them. Are they true? Are they false? What's the short answer? What's the long answer? That's coming out sometime early next year. And I'm working on a book on the switched at birth twins from Bogota, Colombia, which will also be out sometime later next year.
That's great. We'll look forward to those publications.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure, Dave.
And thank you for joining us for this edition of Talking Points. Join us again soon for the next episode. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.